I was absolutely blown away by this scene, so I decided to share my interpretation on it. And after hearing my analysis, if you think I'm pulling this out of my ass, I highly recommend reading into the massive lengths director Makoto Kato and manga creator Nio Nakatani went through to include the smallest details and even the most obscure shots and moments. Starting from the train station, both Yu and Toko are joined as one while they walk home from school after a groundbreaking day for Yu. She discovers the truth about Toko's past and can now decipher what she aims to accomplish in the future, which is why Yu, who usually is a little less bold than Toko and portrayed far more in her shadow, takes the lead when crossing this metaphorical boundary of no return, meaning that their relationship will be forever altered, either advanced or broken down through the next events. Yu's knowledge of her situation puts her ahead of Toko for what seems like the first time in the entire series, which is an interesting change for their dynamic as a whole, especially considering there is dialogue formerly assuming Toko when in a lesbian relationship would assume the male role, but now it seems up in the air, with Yu taking the outward and bold approach. Not to mention the color of this specific scene, a sickening yellow, leaning to what I assume to be either in relation to cowardice, foreshadowing events to happen in the next little bit. I would even argue it's got a hint of remembrance, because of Yu's newfound knowledge of Toko's past being a large influence on her present lifestyle and emotional state. After walking in silence for a bit, mostly attributable to the bombshell Yu is hoping to address, Toko is the first to break, showing weakness in her reliance on Yu for attention or affirmation. That's the thing about unrequited love in this series. Yu's rather flawed and disinterest in the concept of love beforehand all changes when Toko enters her life. And her response to Toko constantly beaming down her love and attachment to Yu is one of her greatest obstacles as a character. Especially since a high school lesbian relationship is so foreign and misinterpretable, the struggle to understand Toko's apprehensive behavior is going to shine greatly as we continue. And before we transition to the major part of this scene, we get a short glimpse of a black cat, which in Western culture usually is a sign of bad luck, but in Eastern culture actually is representative of fortune. And why I think it even exists as a part of this scene is not to wish Yu luck in her mission to emotionally reach Toko through her argument, but instead to ward off evils around her, most notably the worst of society, which always seem to take away the things Toko loved the most, aka her sister as well as her identity. And through this warding off of evil leaves only Yu as a partner capable of understanding Toko on a deeper level than society or the people around her would. Toko eventually mentions this is the first time in a while she has been at this particular location, which I think has a symbolic meaning more than anything else. The layout of the path in front of Toko is representative of an assumable threshold of change. This threshold is a path that defines her individual characteristics, hopes and dreams, and even the relationship that Toko holds dearly. And to cross this threshold would mean sacrificing and losing the things she holds dear in exchange for a more prideful or egotistical outcome that favors her worldview to honor her dead sister. When Toko says it's been a while since she had been there, she is directly referencing this exact example. Toko, back when her sister died, was pushed to make a choice to become or imitate the mannerisms, dream, and appearance of her sister as a way of honoring her life. This sentiment was also echoed earlier in the episode where the teacher, who informs you about Toko's sister's death, explaining that they could almost be twins with how identical they were. And so, Toko once before made the decision to cross an original threshold, giving up her childhood and her own sense of being to become more like her sister and finish all the things that her sister had started. Only until this exact moment she had not extinguished that last part of her individuality that is seen in Toko's feelings towards Yu. But this new destined path laid in front of Toko will be the final evolution and a transition to becoming her sister, and she will lose that last bit of herself to become the very thing that everyone wants her to become. Unless, of course, Yu has something to say about it, and she does. So, Yu drops the bombshell that she is aware that Toko is replicating or imitating her sister. And here we have the first stage of debate opening with a statement of an abrasive fact. After learning that Yu knows the truth about her past, Toko begins what I think is a disconnect from reality. And as she has to come to terms with reality, the more she fears what might come of it. So the solution in her head is to simply avoid confrontation, which is exactly what she does. She even goes as far as to confirm Yu's knowledge as actual fact and asserts her recognition with a smile on her face, seemingly unfazed by Yu's expression of worry. This next part happens quite slowly, as most of the show tends to do, so bear with me when I analyze most of the dialogue here. Eventually, Toko starts to move on to the self-determined path of redemption and maybe even regret. Redemption in the idea that her sister's goal was to make the stage show happen but was dead before she could see it realized. and of course maybe even a little regret from Toko, trying to remedy the sadness in her heart for not spending enough time with her sister and using the stage play as a way to make up for that. Both options are pretty compelling either way. And of course, in addition to this, there are Toko's rather playful leaps across some rocks in the water, which usually symbolize the passage of one life to the next, i.e. Toko taking up her sister's mantle rather seamlessly and elegantly. Also, a little note on the lighting in this particular situation, where the darkness actually takes up more space on the screen than the sunlight, pretty much creating a sense that she is going down a darker path. But the interpretation I found most interesting was that Toko thinks that this is a more mature approach to solving her issue. What I think makes me believe this is that the intentional playful leaping that she does on every single stone, which is completely speaking to me in terms of creating the contrast between an individual who is not ready to enter such a mature decision, as shown by her childlike approach to the matter. On a quicker shot, we get to see the distance between these two in terms of connection. You, which represents the better half of her reality, is blurry and not transfixed compared to the more focused and personal shot of the awkward position of her legs, which I can lightly interpret as confusion, maybe showing that she deep inside actually holds conflict towards the thought of becoming her sister and may feel discontent with the idea more than you might think. Because at this point, you is convinced she can help alleviate the pain or discomfort inside of Toko because of this persona she is forcing herself to keep up, shown by her eventual breakdown before the presidential campaign speech. And speaking of the space between the two, let's take a look at the way the shot is portrayed for a second. Now, usually grass acts as a symbol of connection or community in most cases, but in this scene it acts as a separator or a barrier between the two. And you will have to overcome this barrier, which serves to represent Toko's experience with death and loss, and connect with her in a way that involves reaching the emotional and personal height of Toko's current situation. In the future of this scene, that is exactly what happens. In order to remedy this problem, you must allow the growing idea of love in her heart to reach Toko. She does this by creating conflict in Toko, saying it is indeed reasonable or respectable to want to become like her sister, which will create tensions in her philosophy. Yu continues to argue that Toko was pushing herself too hard to replicate what was lost, which I hardly think is enough emotional justification to compare it to the death of her sister. But eventually, Yu finds the correct words and mentions that Toko's struggle to imitate her sister makes Yu herself worry. And seeing that Toko, who throughout the entire show so far has been completely head over heels for Yu, this definitely hits in a spot that would compare to her sister's death. And through this little interaction, we get to see Yu, someone pretty disconnected with the idea of affection and love, eventually be able to communicate herself effectively enough to garner the attention of someone who also very recently was unable to understand what love was. Pretty groundbreaking character moment here. Anyway, back to the dialogue. Yu brings up our next point of contention, which is that Toko should quit trying to go through with the production of her sister's play and instead remain satisfied with who she is and not who her sister was. And to the benefit of Yu, this is being said out of genuine concern and maybe even a hint of affection. Usually, someone who feels lukewarm about a person wouldn't really go out of her way to request something so selfish. I mean, she is literally asking Toko to stay the way she is because she knows it pains her to be this way. But also, Yu can't love Toko's sister and already has a tough time trying to analyze or come to terms with learning to love Toko. Through more of this scene, we'll come to see Yu become equally as selfish as Toko, which I think is pretty cool to imagine considering Yu isn't really built to be this type of individual in the relationship between the two, and now she actually holds presence and force to make demands. I also really like the juxtaposition between the two characters. Yu is earnestly looking out towards Toko, who is relatively far away, as well as her back to Yu, as if she feels her opinions are not even urgent or impactful enough to even register eye contact. Which, it really is none of Yu's business to meddle in Toko's private life. After all, they aren't really dating. They just have a rather complicated relationship. But I think that Toko is justified in her current state of the argument, especially because since the show's start, she is portrayed to be a frequent utilizer of free will, as seen by her insanely large personality shift to become like her big sister after her death. She quite literally is shaping her own image and destiny to what she deems the best outcome for herself? Her sister? Well, as the conversation flows, we'll find out. In the next line of dialogue, Yu provides more justification for her argument, and since she still represents a portion of society, she makes the suggestion that she, which also just means society, doesn't want Toko to become someone that she is not. And there would be people out there to support and appreciate the more honest side of Toko. But in my opinion, adding this little section was a mistake on Yu's end. Although these lines act as ambassadors of sorts to continue to console Toko, society is the world that Toko despises the most, i.e. her sister and forcibly changing herself. Now Yu, at this point, is heavily invested in the idea that she wants to fall in love with Toko, but cannot really express herself in that way as means to return Toko to a state of equilibrium because it would be pretty shallow. Shallow in the sense that Yu would be using Toko's feelings towards her to win an argument, and, although that may be easier, it seems like both individuals understand that love is something precious and shouldn't be used in a way that makes its power devalued. Hence, Yu leaves that little portion out about her feelings towards Toko, leaving their relationship in an unrequited state. Until later in this debate where becoming shallow and resorting to pulling on heartstrings ultimately becomes Yu's only option. Finally, in this scene, we have a massive change of perspective for Toko, where for the first time she faces Yu to refute her argument, quite literally suggesting that she would rather die than leave her sister's ambitions to die. And what I love most in this entire scene is this moment where the sound completely cuts off and Toko's upfront and sadistic statement assaults your eardrums with the force of a train, quite literally. And to further affirm that Toko has her sights set on this outcome and path for herself, I personally thought of the fatalistic agenda of a train, where trains have one set path for themselves, and to that end, Toko, although capable of utilizing her free will, is not interested in becoming herself, but rather giving into the memory of her sister. The train also shadows Toko, once again creating the idea that Toko's path and sentiments are indeed a bit darker and nonconformist. Even the direction of the train is going in Toko's predestined path. So it basically seems that Yu will have to overcome incredible odds to coerce Toko to reject her sister and become more aligned with society and herself as an individual. And what I also love in this specific shot is how Yu literally hasn't even made a single step onto the rocks yet, pretty much saying that this is all just getting started and we ain't even on the battlefield yet. So the question to ask is if Yu is willing to take on this incredible feat of personal trauma, ambition, and love. Regardless of whether she actually does it, first things first, it's gotta make sense or else it loses consistency with her character, and ultimately would ruin the scene for me. Can she really convince Toko to come to an understanding through her lack of experience in verbal communication? I think that Yu is a dreamer. Most of the creative and more free-thinking minds in society are often dreamers, looking off into the distance and trying to gather and analyze ideas in the mind or through art sometimes. Verbal expression is a form of communication exceptionally important to this end because, at the end of the day, everything one is able to do is ill compared to the ability to express oneself and be understood. And at this point in the show, we know that Yu is a dedicated and strong reader with an ability to make a trusted and informed opinion on the work she consumes. But she really isn't shown to be an analyst in any major ways. She is a very self-contemplative person and fantasizes about the concerns of her day quite frequently, but I don't specifically believe she is one to be so bold to speak up front about her ideas. Or so I thought. Compared to Toko, it seems like a futile effort to debate the sitting class president. But some may forget that in episode 2 that Yu is quite actually capable of speaking her true feelings confidently in front of an audience. But although she is capable of doing that in front of an audience, I would argue that the circumstances make this far harder. Toko is not just a static audience member, but a major component of her evolving conversation and relationship, and an emotionally distressing one as well, leaving the anticipation to see what words will leave Yu's mouth staged quite well. But even so, I'm not fully convinced of the idea of Yu being a central and more dominant force in the ongoing debate. The next little bit is disinteresting because it's mostly flashback, but there's some important dialogue at least. Toko continues to affirm what I already assumed to be true. Everyone around Toko had loved her big sister and no one really cared about what Toko felt. Through the death of her sister, people compared them with only her sister in mind, which pretty much leaves a big void in Toko's mind where her individuality should be. Believe it or not, this type of empathy-building moment happens all the time through the advent of a funeral, especially if you're trying to guilt the audience into falling more aligned with Toko. Funny enough, this exact scene happens in Better Call Saul during Chuck's funeral. So the entire time of that funeral sequence, I couldn't get my mind off the similarity in portrayal and dialogue, which I found pretty funny comparing Toko to Jimmy. Quite literally, I could compare them side by side in that funeral scene and come to the same conclusion that everything in those two's life was orbiting their much more accoladed and achieved sibling. And to that end, both characters try to replicate and adopt the lifestyle of their sibling to impress them or honor them, only to be betrayed by an unexpected death. Anyhow, after this funeral sequence, we get to see a pretty cool metaphor. Toko in this next cut is portrayed as lifeless and robotic with her words and feelings. Hence why she is shot as a reflection in the water and not actually herself. Reflection often separates feelings and emotions in favor of logic, which pretty much is what we are getting here through Toko's dialogue. This shot with the reflection in the water could also be a metaphor for her replication of her sister, becoming identical in what she brought to those around her, but becoming lifeless in the process. And we never get to really see this contemplative side of Toko until this point. She has been pretty sophisticated with her overall mannerisms in school, and she only expresses her affections and passions to you outside of school. And this is exactly what she poses as an analysis of her situation. Her only time to be herself is with you, and to that end, if she were to lose you, even that would not stop her from achieving her goal to finish what her sister started. Which is a noble goal in all fairness. Honoring the dead and committing to incorporate their influence into your life is understandable if they had a large impact on your life. So against these continuously building odds, what would you, who has pretty much been insulted as a negligible factor in her decision, have to say about that? Well, before she can say anything, she trips over and catches herself before she falls. Although faltering before the might of the challenge she must overcome, she is able to hold her ground and make her way onto the battlefield. Yu has committed to the idea in her head. She is able to reach the same emotional plane as Toko, therefore is able to step foot into the arena. Each step really isn't all that important, but the way this shot puts all the attention on a cement pillar is pretty interesting. Now, there's no symbolism of cement that I know of, nor do I think it was the intent, but I think it's meant to represent another obstacle in how we separate the two based on such a huge one, which is why this cement pillar takes up 1/3 of your screen compared to how tiny the characters actually are. Now we're getting somewhere. We got some more reflective metaphorical stuff happening with Yu, where she glances pretty quickly at the water, reflecting on her truths, doubts, and fears of the current situation. Yu is pretty solid on the idea that she could convince her by acting as a mediator to Toko's personal situation, but as I said earlier, she makes the mistake of posing the idea that the world would accept her for who she was, when in Toko's mind she is completely devoid of the idea that the world would hold open arms for who she really was, and instead she believes she would be outcast or forgotten, unlike her prodigal sister. And finally, after what seems like a dynamic of selfishness mostly attributable to Toko, Yu finally has a moment of clarity where she feels the only way to reach Toko is to become selfish herself. After all, if we take a more outward look towards these two's relationship, Yu is really just experimenting with Toko's feelings in order to satisfy her own desire to learn about love. And contrary to that, Toko is using Yu as a piece of comfort, and a way to quell her inner desires and needs rather than treating Yu as a true partner. And Yu's next lines are exactly what I said she would do. She uses herself as means to coerce Toko. After finding no other option or alternative than to use Toko's emotions to her advantage, Yu is pushed to this last-ditch effort. I find this move a bit heartbreaking in some ways, especially considering how much investment Yu finds herself putting into Toko's every action. It's almost obsessive how far Yu will go to contemplate Toko's affectionate attitude, her strong will, or even beauty. So yeah, this hurt a bit. After a little speech from Yu about herself being the center of Toko's world, she actually invokes a little brutal honesty to solve the problem, and doesn't fully commit to the idea of using their love as means to reconnect Toko to the world. Although extremely brutal in its wording, it has more impact than if she just got all emotional and cried her words dishonestly. I think Yu's dialogue acts as a sort of wake-up call for Toko, to return to reality and not accept the situation as it is. That situation being the void of loneliness created by the absence of her sister, and the people around her treating Toko as her sister and not really as her real self. And so, Yu acts as a motherly hand to guide Toko back to the world she has become so unfamiliar with. And to top it off, she also doesn't devalue the individual ambition and strength of Toko by adding that she would only do so if Toko truly wanted Yu to be by her side through all of this. I think this little moment shows how much both of them take each other for granted, especially their attitudes towards each other being so easily manipulated. Wow, that's a lot to take in, I bet. Well, the good news is that there isn't much left to cover. Some of the major ideas that occur are slowly being ironed out through this next sequence. The massive amount of space between the two is slowly being closed in, as both individuals in their most vulnerable and selfish state share an emotional climax and the argument comes to a standstill. Both parties are collectively satisfied with the result of their experience and gain a newfound connection to each other. And finally, the previously rather sickening yellow coloring of the atmosphere and the sky above them becomes a new mix of a passionate red and a now hopeful yellow as a result of their catharsis. And that's it. You have now witnessed the absurdly overkill dissection of what I think Blue Man to You's best scene is. Thanks for watching.